Welcome, voice friends, to another Interviews on Voice Matters. I'm really glad to have you here today, and I'm very, very, very pleased to announce and to present Kittie Verdolini Abbott, who is one of my personal heroes in the field of voice science and one of the pioneers who has made this field possible, has done more research than I can even possibly explain to you at this point. She has a master's degree in speech-language pathology. She has a PhD in experimental psychology and another master's degree in divinity. And she is also a professor of communication disorders, or communication sciences and disorders at the University of Delaware, a brand new job for her. So welcome, thank you so much for your time. We are really glad that you're here today.
Thank you, it's nice to be here.
All right, so one of the things that I'm really interested in for most people who are these, like yourself, pioneers in the field of voice science, is how you became interested in voice science in the first place.
Well, one of my first memories, probably my second memory of my life, was when I was 3 years old, and I was sitting on the kitchen floor, and I had taken some lids from a bottom drawer of the stove, and I was batting them together, and I was singing. I was making vibrato. I was going, ah, 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 ah. And I told my mommy I had this profound announcement that I made, and I said, Mommy, I know what I'm going to be when I grow up, or what I want to be. She said, what? And I said, a singer. And I thought this was a profound moment in life, and it was a profound announcement. And she said, oh, that's nice. I remember her legs, because I was sitting on the floor and I was 3, and she was just kept walking around the kitchen, making dinner. And I didn't think that I was getting enough, that announcement was getting enough attention. But at any rate, I sang all through my childhood, and was always picked to do solos in the children's choirs at church and stuff like that. Sang all the way through high school as well. And then I was a voice major at Indiana University, and had no business doing this. It was thought I was considered to be a lyric coloratura soprano because I was very good at mimicking, and my first voice teacher in high school was a lyric coloratura, right? So I just mimicked what she did. But what we didn't know, and it took decades to figure out, is that I'm actually a lyric contralto, which I know people don't, pants rolls, stuff like that, right? So the lyric part of my voice made people think that I must be able to sing high, and at that time I could. I later found out that a contralto voice, or I read, I don't know if it's true, that a contralto voice often in youth has a really large range, a lot of high notes, and then over time as you mature, you just, I always had performable low C, and they always said, don't do that, right? And so at any rate, I was, training in lyric coloratura literature. I remember at the time that I was first diagnosed with nodules, I was doing Doretta's waltz, I don't know how many times a day with the high C's and the whole thing. And yeah, I came down with nodules, logically, because that is not my voice, but nobody knew that. I was just considered at that point to be a soprano without high notes, right? And that's just such a disservice to people who have low voices. And it's really kind of crazy, parenthetically, because we do think of region or range, voice range, in tandem with weight of voice. And those two things are not necessarily connected. You can have a very high, heavy voice, or you can have a low, light voice, which is what mine was, which is where the confusion, I think, came from. But anyway, I got nodules. And at the time, we're talking 1973. It was the beginning of my sophomore year at Indiana. There were only a few people in the world who did voice therapy with singers. Speech pathologists never did. We were considered lepers. We were considered, you're done. You have nodes, right? You are done. Wow. And, everywhere I went, I went to the ENT who diagnosed nodules, and how did this happen? Well, you're abusing your voice. You don't know my name. What do you know about how I'm using my voice? He didn't even ask anything about my voice use. And I went to the dean of the School of Music, and he said, well, if you have nodules, you're not a singer. I mean, it was devastating. It was just devastating. So I quit school and I moved to New York City. I had a good friend who was singing at New York City Opera at the time, and he sent me to Brodnitz, Friedrich Brodnitz, who was the ENT to the stars in New York City. And he was the sweetest guy. He was Austrian. He was the sweetest guy in the whole world. And he was the first one who said it. He says, I know why you're having problems. I said, why? He said, because you're not a soprano, you're a contralto. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, I'm looking at your chords. They're long and thin. And he says, these are not the chords of a soprano. Is that your problem? So at any rate, there were two voice therapists in New York City. At the time, this was before ASHA started having issues with voice teachers doing voice therapy and calling it voice therapy. So Broadnets had trained this one guy, Orrin Brown, to do voice therapy, because no speech pathologist, voice at the time was the orphan child of speech pathology. Almost nobody did voice as a specialty in speech pathology. So I was supposed to work with Orrin Brown, but he was full. So he sent me to a friend of his in Manhattan, Roland Wyatt, and I had therapy with him, and I lived in New York City, and I got better. I got all better. My nausea went away, and at least according to him, he looked at me with his own mirror, in his own studio. But by that time, being a voice major, because at the time, if you were a voice major, there was only one thing you did, and that was opera. And in terms of classical, the only opera that I ever really did, or did reasonably, was a pants roll, was A Midsummer Night's Dream. It was a countertenor, right? But my voice was simply not made. It wasn't built for opera. It was built for chamber music, for example, if we're going to talk classical. But at the time, if you were studying classical voice, you studied opera. That was it, right? So at any rate, I decided I needed to drop out of the music program, and I thought, well, let me move to Italy. I'm going to do my junior year abroad in Italy. I spoke almost no Italian, but I had met an Italian woman on a plane, and I really liked her. Her name was Federica, and I thought, I'm going to go to Italy. So I went to change my major, and the registrar said, and if you're going to learn a language and major in it, the fastest way to learn it is to go there, right? Mm-hmm. So I went there to the registrar to say I was changing my major to Italian, and I was going to do the junior year abroad in Italy. And she said, do you want a double major? And I said, sure, German. I lived in Germany for a year. I spoke much better German at the time than I did Italian. So I went to Bologna, Italy for supposed to be a year for my junior year abroad at the University of Bologna. This wasn't a special program for Americans. This was the University of Bologna. Mm-hmm. And I started singing again and having a wonderful, wonderful time. And at that point, I was doing folk, rock, and Renaissance. I had two groups that I was singing in, yeah. And it was very Joan Baez-y kind of a folk voice. That worked well with a classical singing orientation. So at any rate, I started singing a lot, and for the better part of 6 years, I was in these two groups, and we either performed or rehearsed every night. Every night. It was wonderful. And I convinced Indiana University to let me stay there for my senior year. So I got my degree from Indiana, but it was with 2 out of 4 years at the University of Bologna, and then I didn't want to go home. And so the easiest way to get a visa to stay was to enroll in another degree program. So I enrolled at the University of Ferrara in Italian letters, and I did my thesis in music history, Aaron Copeland. And so I stayed and stayed and stayed. And you have to take a certain number of exams per year to keep your visa active. So I just didn't take very many exams so I could keep my visa. And the last year that I was there, so I got another degree. So the last year that I was there, I was doing solo performances 3 nights in a row. It was kind of folk rock. It was just me and my guitar, and I came down with really bad bronchitis, really, really bad. But I was going to give these people their money, and I decided, well, the only way I can make it through is to sound like Janis Joplin and to plow through it, right? I was not going to cancel. We don't cancel, right? So I plowed my way through, and at the end of those 3 nights, I had a serious voice problem. What had happened before was nothing compared to this. I had serious damaged nodules and probably hemorrhaging and stuff. We didn't have stroke then. We just had mirrors, and you couldn't look at your own vocals. So it was really bad. So I remember, and I remember going into a recording studio. One of my, the guys in my band had said, yeah, bring her in. She's fabulous, blah, blah, blah. And I opened my mouth to sing, and and I remember all the people in the room who knew me looking at each other going, they didn't say anything, but we just looked like, ooh, okay, this is bad. So at any rate, I could not sing at all. And so I was sitting in my study one day, and I remember the light coming through the window, and I was sitting in this fake leather chair in front of this desk, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this thought came to my head, okay, I'm going to go back to the States, and I'm going to study speech pathology in order to see if I can fix my own problem. I can't keep running back to New York every time I have a problem, plus I knew this one was more severe. And so I did. I went back to Indiana University because that was the one I knew. mean, I knew Indiana, I had been there, and so I knew nothing about the program, and that was really ignorant of me. You know, you should really look into a program before you sign up for it. And I was accepted into the doctoral program, doing my master's along the way. And when I got there, I decided that I loved anatomy and physiology. I had a fabulous professor, Gary Weismer, and acoustics, loved it. Wasn't getting what I really wanted in voice disorders. And so I finished my master's program there, and I decided to go. I didn't, at that point, I was not liking what my options were for my PhD in terms of voice disorders at Indiana. So I applied and was accepted to the University of Iowa to work with Ingo Tietze as my mentor. Unfortunately, 6 days into my PhD program, in the meantime, I had married an Italian otolaryngologist, Gabriele Verdolini. And he had been an ear person largely, but of course, when we got together, he became more interested in voice, which is appropriate. And in the meantime, we had gotten married, and he came over to the States. He wanted to redo part of his residency in the States because his residency in Italy was very, very strong in medicine. He was a good surgeon, but he wanted to have further surgical training in the States. So he was going to be doing some surgical training in the States, and I was going to be doing my PhD program. And unfortunately, very unfortunately, 6 days into my PhD program, our car had broken down. We were walking home at night, and he was struck and killed by a passing car. And so I was not in the mood at that point to continue vigorous PhD studies, so I dropped out. And then when I came back, I went to Italy. I took his body back to Italy. I stayed with his parents for several months. And when I came back, I thought, I can't concentrate. Let me just do my CF. Let me just work clinically for a couple of years, which is what I did in St. Louis. I came back to St. Louis because I have a sister there, and she had a big house with an extra floor that I could live in. So I got a job as a CF in a hospital where there had not been a voice referral in years. Right. And so it took about 6 months of just beating the, path and convincing people that I didn't know what I was doing. Well, I told them I did know what I was doing. I didn't, but I thought I did. It's the usual thing. I know much less now than I did then. I really knew it all. But it took about 6 months for a referral to come in. And then, the referral base started growing. When the ENTs found out that there was somebody there who wanted to do voice and had background in performing voice. And it so happened that while I was doing my CF, Bob Bastian, who is now a well-known laryngologist near Chicago, he was doing his residency, and we found each other, right? And so we ended up building a big practice together. I was at Barnes Hospital, and he ended up getting an attending position when he finished his residency right next door at Jewish. And so we had a fabulous, fabulous practice together. And in the meantime, I forgot to say, when I went back to Italy after my husband's death, it was a hit and run accident, and there were no cell phones. We were on a deserted highway. It was night. And he was in the shoulder of the road, and I didn't know if he was alive or dead, and I couldn't leave his body there. And so the only tool that I had to get help was my voice. I saw about a half a mile away, there was a payphone booth, but I couldn't leave him. And so I just screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed. And it was really interesting because my nodules had not gone away. And when we were walking home, one of the last things he said to me was, when we get home, we're going to talk about surgery for you. He never got home that night, right? So at any rate, I screamed and screamed, had hideous hemorrhaging. I mean, horrible. You could just see barely one little slice of white in my vocal folds at that point. He had taught me how to look at my own vocal folds with a mirror, so I knew what they looked like. And so I said, no ENT is going to touch me except for my husband's professor of surgery, who was an ear guy. Okay, he was an ear guy. Lauda Dio, Pasquale Lauda Dio. So I went back to Italy, to Bologna. I went to Lauda Dio, and I said, what needs to be done here? Gabriele told me that he wanted to talk about surgery. And so he said, I'll do surgery on you. And I just went right into it, even though he was an ear surgeon. He was not a laryngeal surgeon. But it was the luckiest day of my life, because for two reasons. First of all, he took, I think, extra good care of me because I was his protege's wife. Second of all, being an ear surgeon, although he didn't operate on larynx, or rarely did, I met somebody, he had operated on her larynx before for nodules, and he had stripped the vocal folds. She sounded horrible, right? But I said, nobody but Gabriele's professor is going to touch me. So in the mean, he was an ear surgeon, so he's used to operating under a microscope. as opposed to getting margins, which is what you do for head and neck cancer, right? And third thing was, he had just before that, we're talking 1982, just like very soon before that, he had read an article by Hirano, I think, about the different layers of the vocal folds. So the the epithelium and the superficial lamina propria and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know if he made it up or if he had read it. So I had never heard of this being done before, but he did microexcision. He, under the microscope, he cut, made a small paper cut into the epithelium, lifted it up, took out the lesion and redraped, right? And I think it was probably the first time he had ever done it. And I had a spectacular result. And then when I came back to the States and I was working and I began singing again, I was doing concerts. And many, many years later, 92, 93, something like that, and Bastian started operating on singers. As far as I know, he was the first in the country to start operating on singers regularly. It was still very controversial. And so years later in 92 or 93, I was at the University of Iowa. I had a horrible cold. I was coughing. And I decided to take the mirror and look at my vocal folds just to see something technical, right? And I had hemorrhaged again, okay? In the original surgery by Laudadio, he had taken out the nodules, but I had some capillary ectasias, residual from the hemorrhaging that he hadn't touched. So I had these capillaries that were still a little bit fragile, although they gave me no trouble. And when I was coughing, 10 years later, they burst, right? So by that time, Bastian was in Chicago, and I said, I have seen the results of 100 of his surgeries. I've done the rehab on 100 of his patients who've had surgery, and I'm going to go to him. And so I went to him in Chicago, and the night before, I had a pre-op visit, and all of a sudden he said, well, two things. He said, no, I said one thing that it was a question he hadn't asked. I said, Bob, if you get in there and things are worse than we thought, once you open up the tissue, I said, if you have to make a decision about playing it safe, not solving the problem and coming out, or going for broke and risking harming me, I said, go for broke. And he told me after the surgery, he said, that's exactly what happened. And if you hadn't have said that, I wouldn't have. And I had, again, a spectacular result. But this night before surgery, he said, I don't think I ever told you why I started operating on singers, did I? I said, no. And he said, and I'm going to cry here, he said, it was because of your result. And at that point, I felt, of all the years that I was walking around the music building at Indiana University or what have you, thinking to myself, hearing all these beautiful voices, God, why did you give me the mind of a singer, but not the instrument? I was thinking, that's why. I got my voice back, and I got it back in spades. But in the meantime, my voice, my larynx, served as a motivation for somebody to start operating on singers. And so hundreds and hundreds of singers have gotten their voice back from Bastian. And after that, they probably would have anyway, but it became more common, very common for laryngologists to start operating on singers. And I don't want to say that I was the start of it all, but I was apparently my result was the start of something. So how did I get, that's a very long answer, how did I get interested in voice science? As I say, when I went back to the States to do speech pathology, I really only wanted to do voice. But I was reminded that unless I did the whole thing, I couldn't practice voice therapy. Asha was starting to get very vigilant about this. And so I said, okay, fine, I'll do all of speech pathology. But I ended up loving all of speech pathology. I really did. I loved every bit of it. And so, but at the time when I really started practicing and doing my CF, I discovered, because my patients taught me, I really didn't know all that much, and neither did most of us. I believe it was within a month of each other, but I believe Jean Westerman Gregg and I were the first two in the United States to be members of NATS, the National Association of Teachers of Singing, and to be ASHA certified with our Cs. And this was in 1983. So this tells you what a wasteland voice was in the field of speech pathology. And now it's exploded. I mean, it's, since then it's exploded. There are at least 2,000 members of the SAG-3 alone of speech pathologists, many of us with background in performing voice. So a lot of performing vocalists have come into the field of speech pathology, and I think it's really helpful. And I also think it's really helpful that I had surgery myself and had it twice, because I really know from a body perspective what this healing process feels like, which is different for everybody. But, you know, that experience, the experience of having had these lesions, of, you know, of living through the years of, you know, having them and not being able to sing, and, oh, just the agony. So, and that, all of that, and the body knowledge of what it feels like to have that problem, and the body knowledge of recovering from surgery as well, has been incredibly helpful to me. And, you know, for me, I was going to do my PhD with Ingo. And when I came back after 2 years of clinical practice, I was going to go back to Iowa and work with Ingo. And I was right before the start of school, and, or maybe a few months before the start of school in the fall. And I had my plan of study committee in the room with me, and we were discussing. And one was Ingo, one was Eric Lushai, another one was Ken Mall, and another one was Jerry Zimmerman. Jerry Zimmerman was a stuttering professor. He was an expert stutterer, big name. And everybody left the room, and he said he wants me to stay behind. So I stayed behind. He says, how do you like to spend your time? Okay, if you have a free day, do you like to spend it in the lab doing formulas, hooking up machines, you know, running calibration tests? He said, is that your idea of a good time? And I said, no, but I'll do it because it leads to voice, and that's my passion. And he says, no. He says, you can use any tool to lead to voice. He said, start thinking about the way you like to spend your time, right? And the way that I like to spend my time is thinking about the way people's minds work, okay, and brains work. So I was in St. Louis, and by chance, the university, Washington University was in St. Louis. So much of what's happened in my life is by chance. And I didn't look into it. I didn't know that it was one of the best psych programs in the country, in the world. And I just went there, and I applied there, and I applied to neuroscience as well at Washington University. But psych would allow me to take a lot of neuroscience courses, but neuroscience wouldn't allow that kind of crossover. At the time, it was just when I was into my program for a few years that cognitive neuroscience was born, and it was partly born to a great extent actually at Washington University, where I was. And also neuroscience, I asked them, I said, is it a requirement to kill animals? Is that a requirement for the degree? And the chair said, well, I've never thought of it that way, but yeah, you're not going to be able to get a degree unless you do experiments and kill animals. I said, well, I'm not going to do it. So I got my degree in experimental psychology, cognitive science, one of the best things I ever did in my life, not only for the content, but because experimental psychology really teaches you how to design experiments. Because psych can be so messy that if you don't define your terms, and if you don't, if your experimental designs are not just as clear as day, you're just going to find yourself down a really bad rabbit hole. And that has served me well because almost just a few of my doc students have done work in psychology and experimental psychology. All the rest of them have worked in biology, in motor control, in all these other domains. And I've still been able to work with them and I think help guide them to be outstanding scientists because I know how to design a study. I don't, no matter what domain it's in, I know how to do that. And that is complete benefit, or that is complete merit of experimental psychology. But, my idea is truly that anything can lead to voice, any method, any question. And so most of my questions have come from my own voice or from my patient's voice or voices or frustrations that I haven't been able to get something done with a patient's voice. And so, I wish I could say, no, I don't wish I could say. A lot of people want to say that they sat down at the beginning of their careers and they mapped out a whole systematic career. And some people do that. And mine has never been that way. The next steps have always been a eureka, like, what's up with that? Like, ooh, as one of my students says, she says that her brother considers her, he calls her ADSDOLTAS, which is ADOLTAS, which is attention deficit. Oh, look, there's a squirrel, right? And I kind of feel like I'm that way too. I get that way. And I'll just give you one example that happened recently. And then I'll be quiet for a bit. So I'm at the University of Delaware, and I had startup funds, and they're very generous with me. And my chair emails me, and he goes, I've got some money to blow. He says, you want a strobe unit? And I went, that's $80,000. This is extra. And I said, well, I would love a strobe unit, except for our department is not on a hospital setting, and I don't want to strobe anybody outside of a hospital setting in case there's the rare vasovagal response or what have you. And I said, but that's $80,000. You got a lot of money to blow there. And he goes, yeah, okay. Something else you want? I said, well, I was just reading, I bought it at an airport, bookstore. I'm reading a book by Kahneman on thinking fast and slow. Now, from cognitive science, I was familiar with Kahneman's name, fabulous, incredible cognitive science who really did seminal work in a lot of domains, especially in dementia, in attention in the past decades. And I thought, Kahneman's good. Let me pick up this book and read it. And the first couple of chapters were on investigating attention, which is one of the most fascinating subjects in the world, attention. As somebody said a long time ago, everybody knows what it is, but nobody can define it. Well, Kahneman was one of the people who helped to define it. But anyway, so I'm reading this book, and one of the chapters is on measures of attention and using pupillometry to measure attention, how much attention someone is paying to a given task as opposed to something else, which is fascinating if you think about any kind of learning, right? So how much are you in the zone? How much are you completely absorbed? How much are you, taking in? And apparently pupillometry is very well established. If I were reading a book by someone I didn't know, I would have said, well, I need to look into this, but Kahneman, I bought it, right? And so I'm emailing my chair and I go, well, how about pupillometry? And pupillometry, I said, I think it's probably not that expensive, and I think it might be kind of fun to investigate. Plus, other people in the department might be interested in looking at attention too, right? People in child language or what have you. And so he goes, yeah, I'll look into it. And we both looked into it. Well, it's $55,000. He ordered it. So, I mean, that's what I mean. It's so much of what I have done has been by chance. They've been magnets drawing me to them. There was nothing systematic about me picking up that book. I had forgotten my book. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone into that bookstore and bought that one. And I just happened to be reading that chapter when he asked me if I wanted some more equipment. And I just thought it was a cool idea, so we'll see what comes of this. But I'm all excited. I'm a little bit worried, though, because using pupillometry requires a fair amount of technological expertise, which I do not have. So I hope one of my future doc students have technological expertise, as most of them have had to date. So that's a very long answer to a very simple question.
Yeah, and there's a lot of story there to tell, which is why I asked it, because I think it's really important for people to know. And one of the interesting threads that I'm getting from talking to folks is that there is a lot of chance involved, and it really is about following your curiosity. And we are so much in the wild, wild west, I feel like, still in voice science, that you can come at it from any angle, like you said.
Right.
And it's all important.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's the message that I want to get out to the next generation of researchers. Somebody seeing your video, hearing your story can really relate to, oh, I tried this and I tried that, and then look at where we are. And so Thank you for chasing all the squirrels. Thank you for having the curiosity. So one of the things, so I went to SVI in 2012, which is the first place that I had the chance to hear you talk and to learn from you.
Was that at Summer Vocology Institute?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you were working on, or that was to be published, it wasn't quite published yet, was your study looking at vocal fold movement and how the tissue needs to move in order to repair itself. And if you don't mind, I would love to hear how that study in particular came to be and what you think the practical implications of that study are. Because that one study changed my entire life.
Yeah, it was huge. Oh, well, that was another big chance. It was another event, a completely random event that absolutely changed the direction of my career. I was working as director of speech pathology at 4 of the 7 Harvard hospitals in the 1990s, and I had convinced the motor disorders neurologist that he should refer patients for Parkinson's disease, voice and speech therapy for Parkinson's disease. Because until then, there was nothing that anybody could do until Lori Remick came out with her LSVT stuff. So we were getting busloads. I swear, they were pulling up in the morning because he had 600 people on his registry, and he had never sent any of them for voice or speech therapy because nothing was shown to work. But I showed him Lori's work, and so he started referring. So one Tuesday, I did LSVT all day long, 8 or 9 hours, and it is helpful if you're going to get somebody to shout at them. So I've been shouting all day, and that night, Tuesday night, I taught a 3-hour class in a large hall at some local university on Amplify. The next day, I had another 8 or 9 hours of shouting at people with doing LSVT, and another 3-hour class in the evening. And then Thursday, the same thing, 7 or 8 hours, and I was raw. I strove myself. My folds were inflamed. They looked horrible. I was hoarse. You could hear that little hiss coming out before a voice came out right. I was supposed to have a voice lesson. And I called my voice teacher to tell him I wasn't coming because I wasn't in any shape to sing. He didn't answer. So I didn't want to just no-show. So I went to his studio. I think it was Boylston Street in Boston. And his name is Craig Wick. And I said, Craig, I need to cancel. I'd be happy to pay for, half the lesson or whatever, but I really shouldn't sing. No, come on in, sing a little bit. I said, no, Craig, I'm the speech pathologist. I know what I'm doing. No, come on in. He made me come in. And after, I was thinking there's probably something in a contract that I never signed that says if you sing for 5 minutes, you pay for it. I had no idea why he was asking me to sing, right? So I started singing, and a few minutes later, my voice starts feeling better. And 10 minutes later, even better. And 20 minutes later, by the end of the lesson, my voice was completely back, no little hiss. My high notes are sailing, right? And I went, what was up with that, right? But I kind of ignored it. But it happened a couple of weeks in a row. And then by chance, I was out getting lunch, and I ran into my sister's old piano teacher. We're in Boston. Old piano teacher from St. Louis, whose mother was a singer, and he had abandoned his career as a concert pianist, and he had gone into biology of cancer and inflammation, stuff like that. So I said, Andy, does this make any sense to you? It's happened a few weeks in a row. And he goes, duh. I said, duh, what? He says, everybody knows that certain forms of tissue mobilization are anti-inflammatory. I said, everybody knows that? We've never heard of that in my field. And he goes, what planet do you live on, right? And so I started to look into it. I thought, wow, okay, this is a thing. Like the vibrating toothbrush. I think the first domain in which this work was done was in gum tissue. Somehow. And that's where we get our vibrating toothbrush, is that vibrations, certain frequencies and durations and amplitudes of vibrations are anti-inflammatory, right? Mm-hmm. So we decided, I said, well, I've got to look into this, but if I'm going to look at the hypothesis that certain forms, this was classical singing, throughout the pitch range. If certain forms of tissue motion, vocal fold tissue motion, are actually not only harmful, but they're actually reparative, I'm going to have a way to injure somebody, because I'm looking at acute injury right now, injure somebody, feel comfortable that they're going to recover. I don't want anybody to get a permanent injury. And we have to have a way of quantifying the amount of inflammation that they have, and the amount after they've injured themselves, and the amount of inflammation that they have after voice rest, or just sitting around and talking, or these humming exercises. So I talked to Steve Gray about it, and I said, maybe we could get secretions. We could collect secretions from people's vocal folds, because maybe some of these mediators will come from the tissue through into the lumen, into the glottis, and we can collect them there. And he says, I've already done that experiment in my head. He was a physician, a biologist. He knew infinitely more than I did about this. And he said, but I'm not bothering to do the experiment because I've only done it in my head, because the mediators that were interested are too big to migrate to the lumen. You won't get anything. But because I didn't know what I was doing, I did it anyway. Sometimes there is great value to having no clue what you're doing. So we took a colleague of ours who regularly during football season came into the office on Monday mornings aphonic from screaming at football games, and by Wednesday had recovered. So we knew she could trash her voice. We knew she would recover. Plus she was a colleague, and she knew what the risks were. Mm-hmm. So yeah, she screamed her head off for an hour. It was blood curdling, and we got secretions before and then after this screaming, and this was double blinded. So blind analyses of the secretions using this technique called ELISA. And lo and behold, the mediators, there were 3 mediators that are known to come into the tissue immediately after injury. This is from other domains. So IL-1 beta, TNF alpha, and MMP8, they're called. And they all shifted pre to post. They went up dramatically from before to after screaming. And another mediator, PGE2, which comes into the tissue 3 to 5 days after injury, didn't budge. So we felt we had a methodology. So then we did this study but again, I did that because I didn't know what I was doing, right? If I had known what I was doing, I would not have done that experiment. And then we did another, oh, by the way, we know now what wasn't known then, and I think this is in some of Bernard Rousseau's work, that when there is injury, the epithelium becomes more permeable, becomes more porous. So these mediators could migrate, okay? At least some proportion of them, so we could capture them. So then we went on to the study that we wanted to do. We had people come in, speak loudly, actually, not even screaming, for an hour. Not all of them got shifts in every mediator, but most of them did get shifts in some mediators. And then we randomly assigned them to either sit around in the clinic talking normally on and off for 4 hours, or complete voice rest, or these humming exercises, just humming throughout the pitch range, right? With semi-occluded vocal tract and throughout the pitch range. And the pitch range is relevant because in other tissues it's been shown that it's stretching of the tissue that actually deforms cells in the tissue, that actually changes their mechanical signaling to the local tissue and to the bloodstream, which changes and modulates and mediates the concentration of inflammatory mediators. You want some inflammation, but you don't want too much. Because if you get too much inflammation, then good tissue starts getting eaten up, and then you have to reconstruct too much good tissue, and then that's when you get calluses and other things that you don't want, okay? That's too much reconstruction. So yeah, it was in that study that we found that for spontaneous speech, for 5 of 5 mediators, spontaneous speech the next morning had the worst results. So just sitting around talking. Voice rest had much better results. So if we had just looked at those 2 conditions, we would have replicated clinical wisdom, which is if you hurt yourself, be quiet. And then this resonant voice, this humming condition, had people were not only headed back to baseline, they were not only back to baseline, they were better than baseline at 24 hours. That was for 5 of 5 mediators. For one of the mediators, TNF-alpha, voice rest and resonant voice were the same, but for all the mediators, resonant voice was much better, even than voice rest. For a 6th mediator, which is called IL-10, which is depending, it is sometimes triggered, the concentrations are triggered by tissue motion. It is an anti-inflammatory mediator, and it was the greatest in the resonant voice condition, okay? Wow. And it was the worst in the voice rest condition because there was no motion of the tissue, right? So and here we get to another complete chance thing. A month ago, I was doing a seminar someplace, and I was talking about this research, as I often do, and I thought, I never told that voice teacher that voice lesson changed the course of my career and changed the course of much of speech language pathology, because many people now use this. Many therapists now use this approach to acute injury. So I said, let me look him up. I couldn't remember his last name. It was Craig. So I went on Google and I did Craig, voice teacher, Boston, right? And he comes right up, right? So I call him, we email, I said, do you remember me? Of course I remember you. I said, you can't possibly remember this lesson. Of course I remember that lesson. So we talk on the phone, and I said, oh, Craig, by the way, so I told him about the big change that this made in my career, millions of dollars of NIH funding, changing a paradigm in much of our profession. And he said, oh, by the way, I was going back and forth between Boston and Jupiter, Florida, Jupiter, Florida, but now I'm in Jupiter, Florida. Because I had asked him about a voice lesson. He said, well, I'm now in Jupiter, Florida, but I can do them by FaceTime or whatever. And I said, Jupiter, Florida. I said, I think I'm going to be in Miami in a couple of weeks. And then I looked it up, and I was going to be in Jupiter for a conference. What? Right. And his studio was like, 2 blocks from my hotel. His gym was, 1 block from my hotel. So I had a lesson, and this was on my 65th birthday. I had a lesson with Craig Wick. And this time, he did my singing voice is very out of shape. I haven't sung regularly in a very long time. And the more out of shape my voice gets, the less I want to hear it, right? So it's really out of shape. So he did stuff with my larynx in this lesson that I never would have done. Just like I would have never had a horse patient sing, right? But he did it. And I never would have done with anybody's larynx what he did with mine, taking it throughout the pitch range. Oh my God, and I had warned him it was a train wreck, and it was a train wreck, but doing really heavy chest voice and really light, head, and then a mixture that was much heavier than I would have ever had anybody do as a mixture. And I came out, I just kept thinking, I trust you. If it had been anybody but Craig, I would have said, I'm not doing it. But I said, okay, and plus I'm 65, I'm not gonna, be a Metropolitan Opera star anytime soon. So I came out of there and I thought there's got to be damage. There has got to be damage. And I didn't have, I was in Florida and I was at a conference and I didn't have any instruments, so I couldn't look. But I did all those little tests like quiet, high singing and all these little nodule trap type tests. There was no damage. There was no damage. And this was all muscular. So whereas before what he did, which was radical with my voice, was working with the mucosa, okay, healing the mucosa. This was not about mucosa. This was about muscle. And it was TACT balance. And he has a real thing about that. And so he said he had been wanting to do research on it for a long time. And so we've pretty quickly got together and with Ron Shearer and one of my former doctoral students, Leah Lou. Leah did her dissertation and a pre-dissertation using hooked wire electrodes. And that's the only way we're going to get at the question that he wants to ask. He's talking about register mixing and stuff like that. I had one lesson with him on belting, and his approach to belt is basically mixed register or head voice, but with really bright vowels. And you cannot tell the difference. I mean, it sounds like for all the world like belt, but he has this real bugaboo that most people yell, right? So he wanted to look at whether what he thinks he is training in terms of muscle balance. So
are you talking about Craig?
Huh?
Are you talking about Craig?
Craig Wick, yeah.
Okay.
So we got together with, by telephone conference with Ron Shearer, who knows everything about singing in the world, and so does Ingo, so do many others, but Ron, and Leah, who has vast experience with hooked wire electrodes. And so we think we're going to do that. So twice, I mean, I wouldn't have had a voice lesson with this guy if I hadn't been by chance going to Jupiter, Florida. Yeah, like a week from then, you know, I wouldn't have. So at any rate, yeah. So it's all chance. Yeah, it's all chance.
And just so, you know, the layperson can better understand what you're saying about that study, can you tell me a little bit about how that's changed therapy?
Well, my study?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of therapists who've heard about this, and probably most voice therapists have by this point, when somebody gets injured, has an acute injury, and instead of telling them to completely rest their voice, they will teach them to do these humming exercises throughout the pitch range. And how long, we haven't done dosage studies. One of my former students is trying to do dosage studies using simulation, but it's complicated. So basically, me, just messing around, humming, me. There's nothing special about the sequences that I'm doing, and going up as high as is comfortable and back down, and just doing that until you feel the effect. With Craig, and during that lesson, it was a few minutes. And people have also asked the question, does it work for other forms or sources of inflammation, such as laryngitis, right, that you get from viral or what have you? And I didn't know the answer to that question until I got a viral laryngitis, which I'm not very subject to, but I got it. And it took me a couple hours, but my voice was completely restored from a laryngitis that had been going around, and people were aphonic for 2 to 4 weeks. And it completely reversed the course of the disease. My fever went away, for God's sakes. Yeah, my fever went away. And so one of my students who focuses in wound healing and is a real pro, I am not. I know nothing about biology. My students have taught me. Or I knew nothing. I know very little still. But he said, yeah, inflammation is pretty much the same no matter what the source is. And he said, you know, there might be a few differences in the cascade, in the inflammatory cascade, but not much. So, and I've heard many therapists across the country tell me that they have used it, or they've used it with their patients. And yeah, it works. You gotta do it right, though. I once told a professor of mine at seminary, she was hoarse, she had a laryngitis. I told her, I spent 2 minutes with her to do a little bit of humming, and she was worse by the next day, and I saw what she was doing. It was all wrong. And so you can't just, that was a hallway consultation. You have to spend 5 or 10 minutes with somebody. If it's a singer who knows how to manage their voice, you can tell them over the phone. They're fine. But if it's somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience with their own voice, you got to make sure they're doing it right. And anybody who's a voice therapist or a voice teacher, you know what I mean by doing it right, right?
Yeah, getting a resonant sound.
Yeah, getting a resonant sound, forward focus, feeling vibrations in the front of your voice, your face. It's got to be totally easy, no pushing. Yeah.
And it's got to have lots of airflow, correct?
You know, I wouldn't overdo the airflow, because airflow can be damaging. that kind of stuff, I think is like a hurricane in the vocal folds. But you don't want to, you certainly don't want that. You don't want any pressing. So you're not being stingy with your airflow, but you're not blasting airflow.
Right, and you're getting closure too, right?
Yeah. Pretty good closure. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I have literally 100 questions to ask you, so I'm going to pick a couple good ones here. One of the things that you have accomplished in your work is this book right here, with Ingo Tietze. And I'm going to ask, if it is a short answer, might not be, how did that book come about?
Well, that book was in the making for a very long time. At one point, many, many years ago, my first professor job was at the University of Iowa, and I helped Ingo start up the first vocology program. And Plural had approached me and asked me if, to have a contract with them for a book, and I said yes. And then I approached Ingo and I said, well, we'd be better, because my background is not in physics. I mean, I took his acoustics and biomechanics. I'm not completely naive, but I mean, he's a physicist and he's an engineer, and I am not. And I was, at least at the time, and I'm getting back into it, a cognitive scientist. So I said, what would happen if we put our heads together on a book like this? And so he agreed. Then I moved to Boston, but we pursued it. But it was several years in the writing. So it was just, Ingo and I have been, I was his student for a week, before my husband died. And then he wanted, after I finished my PhD, he wanted me to come back up there to be on the faculty. And so we have been close, personally, professionally, since 88 was when I went up there to do a semester with him. So since then, 82 was when I started my PhD with him. So since 82. It was just, I grew out of, I think his major contributions in the book are the postulates. He has postulates that are important for any therapy or training. And then, of course, his stuff on the semi-occluded vocal tract and the overlying of different oscillators. I think that is the guts of his work, which is brilliant in that book. And the guts of my work is probably the motor learning stuff. And a little bit exercise physiology, although the exercise physiology that we did in there is very light. It needs to be improved. And patient compliance, we really need to rethink patient compliance and engagement. I mean, I think it's got the rudiments in there, but I mean, we brought complementary skills and knowledge and out of a personal friendship too, and professional collaboration.
It's a beautiful one that the world thanks you very much for.
Oh, well, I'm very thankful for it. Very thankful.
So
doesn't get any better than Ingo.
It really doesn't. So where do you think the future of vocology is going? And more specifically, where are some areas that you would like to see more research done?
Well, first of all, I think that the major advances in any field, who was it who talked about this? Gramsci talked about it in social politics. It might have been Karl Popper, who talked about it in research or in science, that and Ingo will talk about it in terms of linear predictive coding, LPC or something like that, which is a way to predict the next moment in an acoustic sound. The easiest moments to predict are the ones that are following a trajectory. The ones where programs make the worst predictions are where there's a sudden change in the trajectory that the previous trajectory has not predicted, right? And so in science, I think the greatest advances that we make are those that we can't see coming. And I do think that, I mean, logically, if that's the case, instead of incremental steps, right? Right now, I think we're in a period, the semi-occluded vocal tract stuff was a paradigm shift. Okay, that was a paradigm shift. I think the whole business of training people to do loud voice safely, it was a paradigm shift, okay? And that goes along with resonant voice for adults and children, et cetera, et cetera. Focus on motor learning, I think, is a bit of a paradigm shift. It really colors what we do and how we think about it. But so I think the next greatest is going to come from, oh, look, there's a squirrel, right? Something that we're not expecting.
Yeah.
But what kind of interests me? I have done a lot of work that has not been in cognitive science because my students, I always wanted them to follow their hearts. So I followed them along in what they were doing and tried to help them. But now that I'm in a new setting, I think I'm going to put my foot down and I'm going to start doing myself more cognitive science. brain, mind, attention. What a fascinating subject. Along with my interest in my Master of Divinity degree, I'm very interested in spirituality and health. And I think that there is some radical stuff that we might be looking into. I really want to see us get into more expanded modalities. So I know for years and years and years and years and years, my focus has been on larynx, because I've always said that is the final common pathway, and for the larynx to be right, everything else has to adjust itself around it, because this whole system functions as a package. And I still think that's right. However, I am getting more interested in looking at whole body stuff. So I am trained LESAC practitioner. I'm not as trained as some other people, but I'm a trained LESAC practitioner who is a voice and speech person for theater. And he has 3 body energies and 3 vocal energies that he uses. And sometimes voice issues in my patients have been resolved more quickly with the body energies rather than with any voice technique, right? Because you engage the whole body and the larynx can't help but act in a different way.
Right.
And so one of his master clinicians, Nancy Krebs, who lives in Baltimore, not too far from me, we have been working on a 3 or 3.5 day program to get the basic level of LESAC training. If you're an actor, is about 4 to 6 weeks of 12 hours a day, right? Speech pathologists can't do that. Actors can do that because they're unemployed. They have the time, right? We don't have 4 to 6 weeks that we can take off of work to do this. And so Nancy and I are putting together a 3.5 day program where we're trying to condense things enough that they can be useful for speech pathologists or for voice teachers who aren't doing the whole, enchilada. Where we're training body energies and vocal energies according to LESAC in sort of their essential form. The whole thing of myofascial release and body work is critical. Plans, as far as I know, here at the University of Delaware are to build a rehabilitation spa. My idea for a long time has been to build a voice spa with sulfur waters and all kinds of other stuff, nutrition, body work, meditation, et cetera, et cetera. And when I mentioned that, when I was interviewing here, I mentioned that to the dean, and she flips open her computer and she says, I've got to have you. And she showed me her plans. I didn't know this. Her plans, they are building a wellness spa. Okay.
Wow.
Here. Right. And so, I think if we do take things at the whole body level, who knows, even nutrition can be important for some people. I think some people are more robust, more resistant to injury than other people. And, maybe nutrition does play a role in some of that. My deceased husband was very interested in vitamin A for vocal fold injury, like topically applied vitamin A. So I don't know what that was about, but that's an example. Yeah. So yeah, those are some of the ideas that I have. One of the other domains that I think might be interesting, and I think this goes back to the motor learning domain, is I'm fascinated with Suzuki. And I understand from a friend who's a Suzuki teacher, violin teacher, that you let children listen to a song over and over and over again on a recording, and they're not allowed to play the song until they can't stand not to play it, until they have to. Yeah, and I did that with myself once with it was a piece for contralto and 4-part male chorus. Crazy stuff. I forget, it might have been Schubert, I'm not sure. But anyway, I just listened to it over and over and over and over and over and over again. I didn't sing it until I couldn't stand not to sing it. And I do believe it was very different from most of the other songs, because we singers, we learn things note, 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 note. Oh, I have a problem with E flat. There it is, there's that E flat. But most of the folk songs we learned how to sing, we didn't see notes on a paper, And so I'm really, really interested in that sort of a notion. And also, this is something that Eva van Leer put on Facebook at one point. She said she had gone back to singing like a child. Yeah. Before you had all these techniques. Because I think so many of us have gotten so tied up in techniques, even if we don't realize it.
Yeah.
And so things like that. I'm more interested in stripping away than I am adding on.
Yeah.
So those are just some random, and attention. Yeah, now I've got my pupillometry. Attention.
I cannot wait to find out what you discover with that. That's
yeah.
exciting.
No, but I mean, really, at what point can somebody use, or does somebody use a new voicing pattern while paying attention to what they're saying? Because that's what everybody says. They say, oh, I don't know how, I can't do resonant voice and concentrate on what I'm saying at the same time. Most normal people who aren't singers, singers, yeah, I'm talking about speech. Because speech is the most practiced thing we have ever done in our lives. And so our vocal pattern is more ingrained than anything else. And people say, yeah, I can concentrate. I can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the minute I start concentrating on what I'm saying, that goes away. My old pattern comes back. And that's substantiated by literature, attention literature. And I'd like to see, how many reps does it take? What are the conditions that are going to facilitate the production of this new modality, or this healthy modality, while we're paying attention to something else, like somebody in the back row in the, in the audience. So at what point do singers no longer fall apart on stage, not because of stage fright, but because they can pay attention to the audience and their voice will come out right without having to monitor every aspect of it.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's fascinating. And like I said, there's so much to talk about here. We are kind of coming up on time, so I'm gonna wrap it up and say thank you. And as more questions come up, and as you do more research and there's more to talk about, would you be willing to have another interview at some point?
Sure. And maybe next time I'll be blonde again.
Either way, I don't mind. I just really appreciate your time, and I just appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your history and your story with the world, because there's a lot of power in our personal stories, and I think those are the ones that really change the world. So thank you for your time.
I've been very blessed. And thank you for what you're doing. It's a great service to our profession.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome. All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.